Abby had always known something was wrong with her marriage, but she had never expected this. The front door creaked open, and after 2 long months of silence, Luke walked in, his presence as familiar as it was foreign now. The air around him seemed heavy, not with the exhaustion of travel, but with the burden of something unspoken. Abby watched from the kitchen, clutching her coffee cup as if it were her last grip on reality. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. Not a text, not a call, only vague updates from friends who had spotted him around town with someone else. As Luke stepped into the house, he wasn't alone. A woman followed close behind. Her steps were confident, heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors Abby had once meticulously cared for. Luke didn't offer explanations, only a cold glance in Abby's direction. "This is Mary," Luke said bluntly, his voice devoid of the warmth Abby once knew. "We're getting a divorce." The words echoed in the room like a gunshot, leaving Abby momentarily stunned. She glanced at Mary, who wore an expression of detached amusement, her manicured nails resting casually on the handle of an expensive-looking purse. Abby's mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of her world that had just shattered before her eyes. Abby took a deep breath, her pulse steadying as a strange calmness overtook her. "A divorce," she repeated softly, looking directly at Luke. "In this house? My house?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Luke faltered for the first time since stepping through the door. Mary's smile wavered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Luke's eyes narrowed, but Abby didn't flinch. She had once believed in this man, had sacrificed so much for their marriage, but tonight there would be no more illusions. "Let me make one thing clear," Abby continued, her voice growing stronger. "You can't throw me out of my own home. I've made my sacrifices, Luke. I've stood by you through everything. You walk out for 2 months and now you come back with her." Abby's eyes didn't leave Luke's, though she felt her heart crack a little more with each passing second. She had hoped for an explanation, a confession, something that would explain the distance, the late nights, the growing emptiness in their marriage. But this was betrayal in its most brutal form. Later that evening, long after Luke and Mary had stormed upstairs to discuss their new arrangement, Abby sat alone in the living room. Her mind drifted to the day she and Luke had gotten married. The ceremony had been simple but meaningful. Back then they had dreams, shared ambitions, and promises of a future built together. Luke had been charming and ambitious, his career as a financial consultant taking off with promise. Abby, who had been climbing the ladder of her own career in marketing, made a choice she now regretted. She had quit her job, giving up the career she loved to support Luke's ambitions. She had become the wife he wanted, the partner who would entertain his clients, host dinner parties, and manage the household so he could focus entirely on his work. At the time, it had seemed like a sacrifice worth making. Luke had convinced her they were building a future together, but that future had never really included her. Over time, Luke's late-night meetings became more frequent, the excuses grew thinner, and the emotional distance between them widened. Abby had noticed how distracted he became, how distant his touches felt, and how he seemed more present on his phone than with her. The thought nagged at her for months, until one day during one of Luke's many business trips, Abby had hired a private investigator. It was something she never imagined doing. She had never been the suspicious type, but she also wasn't naive. The investigator returned with exactly what she had feared: photographs of Luke with another woman. And that woman, of course, was Mary. The next morning, as Luke and Mary made their way downstairs, Abby was waiting. She sat calmly at the dining table, a folder of documents laid neatly in front of her. Luke didn't seem to notice at first. He was still trying to sell the idea that they could remain civil about the divorce. Mary, however, noticed the tension in the air and eyed Abby suspiciously. "I have something to show you," Abby said, her voice steady. She opened the folder and pulled out the photographs first, sliding them across the table. Luke's face tightened when he saw them, but he said nothing. "You're not the only one who's been doing your homework, Luke," Abby continued. "I know about the affair. I know about all the lies. But what you might not know is this." She pushed the property documents toward him next. "This house is in my name. I own it." For the first time since this nightmare began, Abby saw Luke hesitate, his carefully crafted facade cracked, if only for a moment. Mary, standing beside him, crossed her arms, her face shifting from indifference to mild alarm. "You can't be serious," Luke muttered, flipping through the papers. "Oh, I'm very serious," Abby said, her voice hardening. "You might have thought you could waltz back in here, throw me out, and play house with her. But you're wrong. This is my home." Mary glanced at Luke, her expression now a mix of annoyance and fear. This wasn't part of the plan, clearly. Abby stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Luke's. I want a divorce, but I'm not leaving this house and I'm not going to make this easy for you. Abby's demand for divorce sent shockwaves through Luke's world. He had underestimated her, taken for granted the strength that had been hiding beneath her composed exterior all these years. But his problems didn't end there. Within days, word of his affair had reached his father, Russell, a stern man who had built his wealth through decades of hard work and discipline. Russell had always been distant with Luke, never quite satisfied with his son's choices, and now this scandal had only deepened the rift between them. It wasn't long before Russell requested a meeting with Abby. They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the social circles they both moved in. I heard about the divorce, Russell said, his voice low but firm. Luke has always been reckless, but he shook his head. This is beyond what I can tolerate. Abby studied the man across from her, noting the tension in his shoulders and the faint glimmer of regret in his eyes. She had always sensed that Russell admired her, though he had rarely said so outright. Now, it seemed, he was offering more than just sympathy. I'm prepared to help you, Russell continued, surprising Abby. Luke doesn't deserve you, and he certainly doesn't deserve to keep everything he's taken for granted. Abby raised an eyebrow, unsure of what exactly Russell was proposing. I'll support you during the divorce proceedings, he said. Luke's assets, the house, you'll get what you're owed. And if you need a job, I can offer you a position at my company. You shouldn't have to start over from scratch. For the first time in weeks, Abby felt a flicker of hope. Russell's offer was unexpected, but it came at a moment when she needed it most. There was a time when she would have hesitated, but not now. Now she was ready to reclaim her life. When Abby returned home that night, the weight of the coming battle settled on her shoulders. She had one more confrontation to face before she could move on, and that was with Luke and Mary. The next morning, she summoned Luke to the living room, where she laid everything bare. Luke, visibly shaken, tried to justify his actions, offering half-hearted excuses about growing apart and unmet expectations. Mary, who had taken a seat beside him, tried to interject with snide remarks, but Abby wasn't having it. You've belittled me for the last time, Abby said to Mary, her voice steady. You've had your fun, but now it's over. Mary sneered, but Luke's face had turned pale. He knew this wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about everything. The finality of Abby's words seemed to echo in the room, suffocating the last bits of bravado that Luke had clung to. His shoulders slumped, and his face contorted as he realized how utterly he had miscalculated. Abby, the woman he had taken for granted, was no longer the passive wife he could manipulate, and Mary, the glamorous distraction he thought would bring excitement to his life, now sat beside him, exposed and vulnerable, her once haughty expression replaced by a flicker of panic. Abby stood across from them, unwavering. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, and there would be no turning back. She placed another set of documents on the coffee table, her final move in the game they had forced her into. These were the divorce papers, already reviewed by her lawyer. They clearly outlined the division of property, including the fact that Luke would get nothing from the house she owned. So Luke scanned the documents, his face tightening with every page he flipped through. You're really going to do this, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Abby didn't answer right away. She had expected him to fight, to argue, or to try one last desperate act of manipulation, but now all she saw was defeat. And strangely, it didn't bring her the satisfaction she thought it would. In that moment, Luke seemed smaller than she had ever seen him, a shadow of the man she had once loved. But love was a distant memory now, buried under layers of deceit and betrayal. Yes, Abby finally said, her tone as firm as ever. This is over, Luke. You made your choice. Now live with it. Mary, sensing the shift in power, tried one last time to salvage the situation. This is ridiculous. You can't just throw him out like this. We'll fight it, but her words faltered as Abby turned her gaze toward her, sharp and unyielding. You'll fight it, Abby repeated, stepping closer to Mary. And what exactly do you think you'll win? A man who just lost everything. A man who used you to escape his own failures. Look around, Mary. There's nothing left for you here. Mary's face flushed with anger, but she had no retort. Abby's words hit too close to the truth, and she knew it. Luke, once the object of her desire, now seemed like dead weight and anchor pulling her down. Abby could see it in her eyes. The romance was already beginning to unravel. So without another word, Abby left the room, leaving Luke and Mary to confront the reality of their situation. The divorce was finalized within weeks, Much to Luke's dismay, he had fought, of course, but Abby's preparation with the help of Russell's legal team had been airtight. The settlement left Luke with little more than the clothes on his back and a small bank account. The house, the cars, even the investments, they were all tied up in Abby's name, or through clauses that Luke hadn't bothered to read when they were initially signed. Mary stayed with Luke for a short time after the divorce, but their relationship quickly deteriorated. The financial strain became too much for Mary, who had always thrived on luxury and status. Without the house and the lavish lifestyle Luke had once promised her, she began to drift away. It wasn't long before Mary left him altogether, moving on to a wealthier man she had met through mutual friends. She vanished from Luke's life as easily as she had entered it. Luke, once a man of status and connections, found himself in a downward spiral. With no assets and a tarnished reputation, he was forced to take on menial jobs, far beneath the career he had once enjoyed. The whispers of his affair, and how spectacularly it had backfired, followed him wherever he went. He became a cautionary tale in his social circles, a once promising man brought low by his own hubris. Meanwhile, Abby found solace and strength in the new life she was building. She had taken Russell up on his offer to work at his company, initially as his secretary, but her keen intellect and experience quickly caught his attention. It wasn't long before she was promoted, taking on more significant roles within the company. Russell respected her tenacity, and their working relationship blossomed into a genuine friendship. They often spent time together after work, discussing business strategies and life, with Russell offering guidance that went beyond the office. Abby, for the first time in years, felt a sense of control over her own destiny. She had been trapped in the role of Luke's wife for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have her own ambitions. Now, with her career reignited and her confidence restored, she began to see a future that was no longer defined by someone else's needs. She could finally pursue her own happiness, unburdened by the weight of a loveless marriage. But even as her professional life flourished, Abby found herself reflecting on the emotional scars that remained. Trust was not something she could easily rebuild, not after Luke's betrayal. Yet, she wasn't closed off to the idea of love. She had learned valuable lessons about herself, about boundaries, and about what she truly needed in a relationship. One evening, as she sat in her newly decorated living room, sipping a glass of wine, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The house was quiet, peaceful, a far cry from the chaos that had once consumed it. She had survived the storm, and now the horizon looked bright. 6 months after the divorce, Abby was thriving in her role as one of Russell's top executives. The company had grown under their combined leadership, and Abby had found a passion for the work that surprised even her. She had never imagined herself in the corporate world again, but the challenges and rewards had reignited a spark in her. One afternoon, after a particularly successful meeting with a new client, Russell invited Abby to lunch. They sat in a small bistro, the kind of place that catered to quiet conversations and thoughtful exchanges. "You've done well, Abby," Russell said, his eyes full of approval. "Better than I ever expected." Abby smiled, a genuine warmth filling her chest. "I've had good guidance," she replied, raising her glass in a small toast to him. Russell chuckled but then grew more serious. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You deserve more than just a career. You've earned a chance at real happiness, Abby. I know Luke shattered your trust, but not every man will." Abby paused, her smile fading slightly as she considered his words. It wasn't that she didn't want to find happiness again, but the wounds were still there, tender and raw. She looked at Russell, this man who had been so kind to her when she needed it most, and wondered if he saw the loneliness that still lingered beneath the surface. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted softly, swirling the wine in her glass. Russell nodded, his gaze understanding. "Take your time," he said gently, "but don't close yourself off. You have so much more to offer the world and to someone who truly appreciates you." The conversation drifted into lighter topics after that, but Abby couldn't shake Russell's words from her mind. Later that evening, as she walked through the park near her home, she allowed herself to think about the future not with trepidation, but with hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was room in her life for more than just work and survival. Maybe there was space for love again, a different kind of love, built on mutual respect and trust. As she reached the edge of the park, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the trees, Abby felt a quiet sense of peace. The chapters of her life that had been marred by betrayal and heartache were finally closing. Ahead of her was something new, something unknown, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Months later, as autumn leaves began to fall, Abby stood on the porch of her home, the cool breeze brushing against her face. It had taken time, but she had made peace with her past. The scars from Luke's betrayal had healed, though they would always be a part of her. They were reminders of what she had overcome and how much stronger she had become. Russell, ever the supportive friend, had been a constant presence in her life, but their relationship remained purely professional, despite his subtle encouragement. Abby wasn't ready for anything more. Not yet, but she had learned that she was enough on her own. For now, that was all she needed. As she sipped her tea, watching the last of the daylight fade, she smiled to herself. There were no more secrets, no more lies, no more betrayals lurking in the shadows. Her life was hers again, and that was the happiest ending she could have imagined. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow,